Okay. I have a first question for all of you. Does anybody have a gun on them? Live aim. You got to ask that these days, don't you? Yeah. Anyway, thanks for coming. Thanks to Joseph Beth for doing this. I've got some photographs to show you to go through this story, but it is really one of the most fascinating stories of American history that has not been told. So I think you'll find this very interesting. But let me start, as I did a couple weeks ago. I launched this book in Marion, Ohio, which is where Harding's from. And I started off by saying to that crowd, who obviously loves Harding, that there are 4 things I want to tell you about Warren Harding before I get into these love letters, because he has been very badly treated by history. And I want to start off with good things that he did, and then talk about this in the context of these letters and this affair and what happened. But most people do not understand what a good president he really was. And I think when you read this book, you will also get a feeling for the person. He has been painted as a complete cartoon in history, very unfairly, and I hope that things will change from this point forward. The guy who wrote my foreword, John Dean, wrote a biography of Harding, which I think begins to turn the tide. As Dean said to me, I helped get rid of one president, and I'm hoping to lift up another. But it's very true. Dean actually lived in Marion, Ohio as a young adult, and so he knew a lot about Harding. But let me tell you the 4 things I want you to know about him as we get started. First of all, Warren Harding, when he became president in 1920, this was after the Great War, and the world was literally on its knees. And the United States was the stability in the world. And it was great that Warren Harding became president at that time, because he really brought stability to the nation and to the world. And let me tell you the first thing I want to tell you about him, and that is that in his first year in office, he pardoned Eugene Debs. I've got a picture of Debs, and I have a federal judge here who actually sits in the courtroom where Eugene Debs was tried, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he pardoned Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was put in prison by Woodrow Wilson for speaking out against the draft in the war in Canton, Ohio. And he got a 10-year sentence simply for saying, I believe this is a capitalist war. Now, do we have a First Amendment or do we not have a First Amendment? And so Warren Harding was the guy who pardoned him. Nobody remembers that. And it was important because labor was in great strife at this time around the world. And you all know what happened to Germany after the First World War. Chaos. Russia, chaos. The United States was stable. Warren Harding was a big part of that picture. So keep in mind the Debs, and we'll come back to that in a second. Secondly, Warren Harding went to Birmingham, Alabama, and made a civil rights speech that would put people to shame today. Does anybody know that here? Does everyone here know the term Teapot Dome? Yes, but nobody remembers that he went to Birmingham, Alabama. Now let me set the stage for a second. He goes to Birmingham, Alabama. 100,000 people gather. He's president of the United States, first president to go in the Deep South since the Civil War. And his speech is, democracy is a lie if blacks do not have political equality. In Birmingham, Alabama. He was booed by the whites. And by the way, the whites on one side, the blacks on the other, separated by a chain link fence. The blacks cheered wildly for Harding. It was a very important moment in our history, and Harding did that. People don't remember that. Let me tell you the third thing I want to tell you about him. Warren Harding was the president that brought about the very first arms limitation treaty. After the Great War, after everybody had built up all their, and you remember this was Britain and ships and destroyers and so forth, the Washington Conference was under Harding. That was the first arms limitation worldwide treaty ever. Nobody remembers that. They took ships out in the ocean and sunk them. Fourth thing I'll tell you, Warren Harding started the Office of the Budget. He was very fiscally conservative. The country was in chaos financially. Europe could barely pay their debt to us. They were on their knees, as I said. And he established an Office of the Budget. Mellon was his Secretary of the Treasury. And that brought stability to our economy, to our government. And so it was very important. He was a very important bridge from this disaster of the Great War to the rest of the century. So I want to tell you those things about him because I think that everybody here probably has a very bad opinion about him. He's rated as one of the worst presidents in American history. Far from it. Far from it. His record needs to be reviewed. All right, with all that said, let me get into what this book is about, because this book is about a long-term affair with the love of his life. Her name was Carrie Phillips, and I'll tell you how their relationship started. But let me first make sure this works. John Dean, as I say, did the foreword to this book. All right, so here's a picture of Warren Harding delivering State of the Union address. You see Coolidge sitting behind him in the vice president's seat. He was, number one, he was a great speaker. He was sought after around the country to be a speaker. So that's a picture of him to start this off with. As I said, he was elected to succeed Woodrow Wilson as our 29th president. He won in a landslide. His victory, as I'll tell you, was one of the biggest in American history. And you know, he was a guy that everybody felt brought a breath of fresh air to America. Remember, Wilson had had a stroke, and the White House was closed, and Wilson, essentially, his wife was running, Edith Wilson was running the government. And you can see Wilson is a little disabled in this picture. I think this is the guy named Joe Cannon, who was the Speaker of the House. They're on their way to the inauguration. All right, now, as I just told you, Eugene Debs gave this speech, and this is a picture of Debs in Canton, Ohio. Judge Wells is here. She's one of our federal court judges, and she took me through a tour of her chambers in the old courthouse, which is now the Metzenbaum building, to tell me all about how Eugene Debs was tried in this courtroom back in 1917. She brought up all the files from the jury instructions and so forth. Debs gave his own closing statement. He also gave a statement to the judge as he was being sentenced. And he said, it's a great, wonderful statement. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but as long as there is a lower class, I'm part of it. As long as there's a criminal element, I'm of it. And as long as there's a person in prison, I am not free. And it's remarkable stuff. He was a great leader. He ran for president 4 times, including from prison in Atlanta in 1920. Got almost 1 million votes. So he was very instrumental. He was a socialist candidate, and how the word socialist is misused these days, I tell you. But in any event, he was a great person. Harding recognized this, recognized that it would be a healing thing to pardon him. When Woodrow Wilson, before he left office, was asked by his attorney general to pardon Debs, he wrote denied across the top of it. He was very stubborn, very willful, and he was very angry with Debs for not supporting the war. So just to give you a contrast between those two leaders, everybody, and I am a fan in part of Woodrow Wilson. I am, as you will hear, I have my problems with him too. But in any event, if you contrast those two personalities and what they did, that's a significant thing to me. The other thing I was talking about here is the Alabama speech. And the New York Times article says, Harding says Negro must have equality in political life. That's October 27, 1921. And this is the headline from the New York Times: Harding supports new policy in the South. Something nobody knows about, but a very important thing in our history. October 26, 1921. Okay, so here is Warren Harding with his family. First thing you need to know about Warren Harding and his family is that his mother, who is sitting next to him, right to his right, was a very religious woman. She converted to Seventh-day Adventism. In part, they lost 2 of their siblings on one day. And, you know, that's the way it was back in those days. You know, somebody could die of disease just like that, and these 2 kids were gone within a day of each other. And his mother converted to Seventh-day Adventism. You may not know a lot about Seventh-day Adventism, but it's an interesting, you could have a whole speech on that in and of itself.